Sarah Mitchell had always been the quiet type. At 52, she lived alone in a modest two-story house on Maple Street in the affluent Willowbrook neighborhood. Her lawn was always perfectly manicured, her mailbox painted a crisp white, and her flower beds bursting with seasonal blooms. To her neighbors, she appeared to be just another middle-aged woman living a simple suburban life. They had no idea what lay beneath the surface. The Willowbrook Homeowners Association was notorious for its strict rules and even stricter enforcement. Led by the imperious Margaret Thornton, a woman who treated HOA violations like federal crimes, the association had driven out more than a few families over the years. Margaret, with her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer suits, ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, flanked by her loyal followers, Richard Blackwell, a pompous real estate agent, and Janet Collins, a gossipy retired teacher who seemed to live for drama. Sarah had managed to fly under their radar for the 3 years she'd lived in Willowbrook. She followed every rule, paid every fee, and kept to herself. But that peaceful existence was about to come to a crashing halt, and it would all start with something as innocent as a garden gnome. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Sarah placed the small ceramic gnome among her chrysanthemums. It was a gift from her late grandmother, a whimsical little figure with a red hat and a fishing pole. To Sarah, it was a cherished memento. To Margaret Thornton, it was a direct violation of Section 4.7 of the HOA bylaws. No decorative lawn ornaments exceeding 6 inches in height shall be displayed in front yard. Areas. The gnome was exactly 7 inches tall. Margaret spotted it during her weekly compliance walk. Through the neighborhood, she was accompanied by Richard and Janet, as usual, all 3 of them scrutinizing every property like military inspectors. When Margaret's sharp eyes landed on the gnome, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Well, well, well," Margaret said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "It looks like our quiet little mouse has finally slipped up." She pulled out her phone and began taking photos from multiple angles. "Richard, make note of this violation. Section 4.7, clear as day." Richard adjusted his glasses and scribbled notes on his ever-present clipboard. "Should we issue a formal warning first or go straight to the fine?" he asked, barely able to contain his excitement at catching someone in violation. "Oh, we'll start with a warning," Margaret replied with a cold smile. "But something tells me this won't be the end of it. People like her always think they can get away with more once they start breaking the rules." Janet nodded eagerly. "I always knew there was something off about her. Too quiet, too perfect. It's always the ones who act innocent that cause the most trouble." That afternoon, Sarah found the violation notice tucked under her windshield wiper. The formal language and threatening tone made her stomach drop. She had 48 hours to remove the unauthorized decorative element or face a $500 fine. The notice was signed with Margaret Thornton's flowing signature, followed by her title, Willowbrook HOA President and Compliance Director. Sarah stared at the notice, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from something else entirely. Something that anyone who had served in combat would recognize. The slow burn of controlled anger. She carefully folded the notice and walked back into her house, her movements precise and deliberate. The next morning, Sarah removed the gnome. She followed the rules just as she always had. But this time was different. This time she began to pay attention. She noticed Margaret's daily walks, the way she peered into windows and took photos of properties. She observed Richard's routine of measuring grass heights with a ruler, and Janet's habit of eavesdropping on phone conversations from her front porch. For 2 weeks, Sarah watched and learned. Then came the second violation notice. This time it was for her garbage cans. According to the new interpretation of Section 3.2, garbage cans had to be stored completely out of view from the street at all times except for collection day. Sarah's cans were in her side yard, partially visible from a specific angle on the sidewalk. The fine was $750. Sarah paid the fine without complaint, but something had shifted in her demeanor. Her neighbors began to notice a change. She walked differently now, with purpose and confidence. Her shoulders were straighter, her gaze more direct. But Margaret Thornton was too drunk on power to notice the warning signs. The third violation came just a week later. Margaret had decided that Sarah's front door wreath was excessively large and gaudy, despite the fact that similar wreaths hung on a dozen other doors throughout the neighborhood. This time the fine was $1,000, and it came with a threat. Continued violations may result in legal action and forced removal from the community. That evening, Sarah stood in her kitchen, staring at the violation notice. She rolled up the sleeves of her cardigan, revealing something that had been hidden for years. On her left forearm, in bold black ink, was a tattoo that told a story Margaret Thornton couldn't have imagined. The eagle, globe and anchor of the United States Marine Corps, surrounded by the words Semper Fidelis and Operation Enduring Freedom 2003-2009. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a quiet, middle-aged woman. She was a decorated Marine Corps veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, leading supply convoys through some of the most dangerous territory in the world. She had earned a Purple Heart, 2 Bronze Stars, and the respect of every Marine she had ever served alongside. She had commanded troops, made life-and-death decisions under fire, and never once backed down from a fight that mattered. And now, for the first time since returning to civilian life, she found herself facing an enemy that truly deserved her attention. The next morning, Sarah did something she hadn't done since moving to Willowbrook. She put on her dress blue uniform. Every ribbon, every medal, every insignia was perfectly placed according to Marine Corps standards. She looked in the mirror and saw not the quiet woman her neighbors knew, but Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, United States Marine Corps. At exactly 10 o'clock, Sarah walked out of her house and straight to Margaret Thornton's front door. She rang the doorbell and waited, her posture ramrod straight, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military bearing. Margaret answered the door, wearing her usual condescending expression, but it faltered slightly when she saw Sarah's appearance. "Ms. Mitchell," she began, her voice uncertain, "is there something you need to discuss? Because if this is about the latest violation, I'm afraid the decision is final." "Actually, Mrs. Thornton," Sarah replied, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable tone of authority, "I'm here to discuss your pattern of harassment and selective enforcement of HOA regulations." Margaret's face flushed red. "Harassment? How dare you? I am simply enforcing the rules that every resident agreed to follow. If you can't handle living in a quality community with standards, perhaps you should consider relocating." Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Ma'am, I've lived in places where standards actually mattered, places where following the rules meant the difference between life and death. And in those places, leaders led by example and treated everyone fairly." "I don't know what you're implying," Margaret snapped, "but I don't appreciate your tone. And I certainly don't appreciate you showing up at my door in some costume trying to intimidate me." "Costume?" Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly. She slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing the Marine Corps tattoo that had been hidden for so long. "Mrs. Thornton, this isn't a costume. This is my dress blue uniform, United States Marine Corps. I earned every piece of it serving my country for 12 years, including 3 combat tours in Afghanistan." Margaret's expression began to change as the reality of who she was dealing with sank in. Her bravado started to crumble, but she tried to maintain her authority. "Well, that's very nice, but it doesn't change the fact that you've violated HOA regulations multiple times." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right. I have violated regulations. 3 times to be exact. A 7-inch garden gnome, garbage cans visible from a specific angle, and a Christmas wreath that was apparently too festive for your liking." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But here's what interests me, Mrs. Thornton. In my 3 years of living here, I've documented 47 violations of HOA regulations by various residents that have gone completely unaddressed." Margaret's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sarah reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a manila folder. "Richard Blackwell's boat has been parked in his driveway for 6 months, violating Section 2.4. Janet Collins has a fence that exceeds the height limit by 4 inches, violating Section 5.3. Your own driveway has oil stains that violate Section 7.1 regarding property maintenance." She opened the folder, revealing dozens of photographs and detailed notes. Should I continue? By now, Richard and Janet had noticed the commotion and approached from across the street. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw Sarah in her military uniform. The authoritative way she carried herself, and the look of absolute terror on Margaret's face. "The question," Sarah continued, her voice remaining perfectly calm, "is why my violations warrant thousands of dollars in fines and threats of legal action, while these violations are ignored entirely. In the military, we have a term for this kind of behavior. We call it selective enforcement, and it's considered a form of harassment and abuse of power." Margaret tried to regain her composure, but her voice shook. I don't have to stand here and listen to this. You can take your concerns to the HOA board meeting if you have issues with my leadership." Sarah smiled again, and this time it was genuinely amused. "Ma'am, I've already done that. I've filed formal complaints with the state HOA Oversight Committee, documenting the pattern of selective enforcement and harassment. I've also retained legal counsel specializing in HOA disputes." She paused for effect. "And I've submitted a formal petition signed by 63% of the residents calling for your removal as HOA president." The color drained from Margaret's face entirely. Richard and Janet exchanged panicked glances, realizing that their little reign of terror was coming to an end. "But here's the thing," Sarah continued, stepping closer. "I didn't serve 3 tours in Afghanistan to come home and be bullied by someone who gets their kicks pushing around their neighbors. I faced down actual enemies, Mrs. Thornton. People who wanted to kill me and everyone I served with. So your little power games, they don't scare me. They just disappoint me." Sarah turned to address Richard and Janet, who were still standing frozen on the sidewalk. "Gentlemen, ladies," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of military command, "I suggest you start treating your neighbors with the respect they deserve. 'Cause I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not backing down." As Sarah turned to walk back to her house, Margaret finally found her voice. "This isn't over," she called out weakly. Sarah stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "Ma'am, it's been over since the moment you decided to mess with a Marine. You just didn't know it yet." The story of Sarah Mitchell spread through Willowbrook like wildfire. Within days, the entire neighborhood knew about the quiet woman who had turned out to be a decorated war veteran. Some residents approached her with apologies for not standing up to Margaret's bullying. Others shared their own stories of harassment and selective enforcement. 2 weeks later, at a packed HOA board meeting, Margaret Thornton was removed from her position by an overwhelming vote. Richard Blackwell resigned in disgrace, and Janet Collins found herself suddenly very interested in minding her own business. Sarah was elected as the new HOA president by unanimous vote. Despite not even running for the position, her first act was to implement a fair and transparent enforcement policy that applied equally to everyone. Her second act was to organize a neighborhood barbecue where everyone could get to know each other as people, rather than potential violations waiting to happen. As Sarah stood in her front yard on the day of the barbecue, greeting neighbors she was finally getting to know, she smiled at the small ceramic gnome that once again sat among her chrysanthemums. Sometimes, she reflected, the smallest battles prepare you for the bigger wars, and sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should never underestimate. The Marine Corps had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was this: never leave a fellow citizen behind, especially when they're being attacked by bullies who abuse their power. Margaret Thornton had made the mistake of thinking that quiet meant weak, that polite meant pushover, and that civilian meant she had forgotten how to fight. She had been wrong on all counts, and now the neighborhood of Willowbrook was a better place for everyone, protected by someone who actually understood what it meant to serve others rather than herself. Sarah looked at her tattoo, no longer hidden beneath long sleeves, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Semper Fidelis wasn't just a motto, it was a way of life, and she would always be faithful to the principles she had sworn to defend. Whether on foreign battlefields or in suburban neighborhoods where bullies thought they could push people around without consequences. The war for Willowbrook was over, and the good guys had won.